Before I get into the serious part of seed saving and seed stories and histories and all of that, I want to share a few little stories with you that I've heard out at Knoxville Seed Company. Knoxville Seed Company has been in operation for many years, and I know the folks out there very well. Now, they have told me some stories that probably none of you will believe, but I thought it'd be nice to start out with a little humor before we get going on the rest of it. Now, they make the point that you would not believe some of the things that they hear in a seed store. For instance, last year, someone came in and they wanted to buy some cream-style corn. This is the seed, mind you. This is the seed for cream-style corn. They said, well, we've got all this, got about 25 different varieties of corn. He said, no, I don't want those. I want cream-style corn. It wouldn't do, but she bought some cream-style corn. Well, that's one example. Now, the next one was a fella came in, and there were about 15 people in line. And this man comes in, and he was in a hurry. He said, I can't find any of your peanut trees out back. I said, where are the peanut trees? One of the old farmers in line turned around and looked at him and said, are you a complete idiot? Peanut trees. So every time I go in now, I ask if the peanut trees have come in yet. Another good one was this. A fella came in and bought some grass seed, went home and planted it. It came up, it was green. Then I had a dry spell and it turned brown. And his mama told him, son, the reason that grass is brown is because that seed you bought was brown. So it's brown grass seed. So he took it back to Knoxville Seed and said, I want some refund on this. My grass is brown. They said, well, did you water it during this drought? And they said, no, I didn't put any water on it. Another example of interesting thing. Now, another one of the better ones is this. Someone came in and they wanted fried green tomato plants. You know, we all like those fried green tomatoes in the summertime. Again, they said, well, we've got a whole shed here just full of all sorts of tomatoes. And they said, no, it's not the right ones. I want the fried green tomatoes. Well, this goes on and on and on. But I just thought I'd start you out with that to let you know that somebody else out there is worse off than you are when it comes to plant knowledge. Tonight's theme is seed stories. And I've got so many seed stories that I've collected over the years. Now, right up here in this front row, we've got a young couple. I was surprised to look out there and see them. They're from Washington Parish, Louisiana, Franklinton. And we've worked at the Washington Parish Free Fair for years. And that's...
Thank you for what you do for us.
And it's a wonderful pleasure to have you here. Many seeds, this documentary that was done on me, John Coykendall's Journey to Save Our Seeds and Stories, is about Washington Parish, Louisiana, where I've spent many years, since 1973. And I began recording the stories and histories of the people I knew there. And I was fascinated with the stories of the old farming ways, what they grew, how they grew it, how they used it, how it was prepared, how it was saved. And over the years, I've collected a lot of seeds. While talking about a seed story, I'm going to tell one since I'm on that subject. You two will remember this. The unknown pea of Washington Parish. That was a famous old field pea that was grown in the cornfields and in separate patches too. Starting the early 1900s, possibly into the late 1800s, they grew a pea called the unknown pea. And when I was asking about that, I said, why was it called the unknown pea? And they said, well, no one knew the name of it, never had a name. It was just referred to as the unknown pea. And I thought, gosh, this is wonderful. Being a seed saver, I wanted to get some seed of that. And I started asking around. And all the old timers said, well, it's gone now, it's extinct. Doesn't exist anymore. That reminds me of an old fellow. This was up close to my farm here. I asked him about an old corn, the Webb Watson corn, and he thought for a minute and he said, I believe that corn's what you call instinct. Well, luckily I used my instinct. We did finally find some of it. But anyway, back to that unknown pea. Looked and looked forever for that. A fellow named Gus McGee, who does a lot of wonderful woodworking, he had been looking for about 30 years to help me out with that, and he was about to give up, but he found an old man in the community named Dan Seal, who was 87 at the time, now deceased, who had some of the seed of that. And he brought me a little medicine vial of those seeds, and I was so thrilled. I remember that was October. Of course, it's a long way till the following spring when you can plant these. And every night I would have these on the nightstand. Before I'd go to sleep, I'd unscrew that little top and pour some out and look at them and study them for a couple of minutes, pour them back in, seal it up. And I would do the same thing in the morning, wake up, thinking, is it time to plant yet? Of course, we had months to go. So I waited and waited and waited, and the first crop we grew was up at Blackberry Farm, and it was a great success. I remember I was excited to take seed back to Louisiana where this pea originated. But as seed savers, this is one of the dilemmas we face. So many things have been lost over the years. Now, you were going to give me a pea. You called it the Theodore pea, didn't you? This was a family. That was a family pea, another one, and it had kind of a sad story in the ending. If my memory serves me correctly, there was floods and storms, and you were, well, I think maybe up here, and that pea got thrown out and washed into the canal, and so much for the Theodore pea. But we have lost something upwards of 94% of things that were in the USDA seed collection in 1903, because they did a study in 1983 to see how many things were still left. And this ties in with our seed stories, because those are a lot of stories that are gone now. And in this study, they started out with what was in the USDA collection in 1903. This is crop for crop: corn, beans, potatoes, squash, pumpkins, you name it. Everything that you can think of seed-wise, food crops. They went through that, and there would be 94% loss, 97%. There were a few things 100% loss. All of these staggering losses. And it made me wish, if I had one wish, I wish that we could have started out 100, 150 years ago when we still had so many of these old things available, when we could have saved and brought those forward. I've asked a lot of people, the old timers, why did these things disappear? One of my old buddies down there, Mr. Arlie O'Brien, he'll be celebrating his 99th birthday this August. I asked him, I said, Mr. Arlie, what happened to those old peas and these different crops? He said, well, Uncle John Hunn said they brung in the new ones and they made away with the old ones. In other words, people they didn't realize the value of it, how important it was to save these things. Now, in our region here, we are very, very fortunate. A good friend of mine named Bill Best, who runs the Center for Sustainable Mountain Agriculture up in Berea, Kentucky. Bill has a huge collection. He raises these wonderful heirloom tomatoes, the ones that have the real flavor. They're fantastic. Now, I thought I was a big bean collector. I've got something over 400 varieties. Well, when I talked to Bill, I learned I was in a distant second place. He has 1,400, probably a lot more by now. But he showed me something that was of great interest, and this pertains to seed saving and seed stories and how things are handed down. And the point he made really illustrates something very important about our region. In his seed processing barn, Bill has a huge topographical map, about so big. He has that up on the wall. Now, in the center of that, he has a pin stuck in the Cumberland Gap between Tennessee and Kentucky. Now, this pin is stuck in there, and he has a string that goes out so far. This represents a 100-mile radius. You make this circle with this. You start up in eastern Kentucky, East Tennessee, western North Carolina, southwest Virginia, West Virginia. And what these areas all have in common is they're marginal, very rugged mountain lands. In other words, you don't have thousands of acres of corn, cotton, and soybeans like you would in West Tennessee, or states with very flat agricultural lands. These are marginal lands, and the families that settled on these farms, they were seed savers by necessity. There wasn't any, they couldn't afford to buy seeds. There was nowhere to buy them to start with. And they relied, being seed savers by necessity, trading seeds with neighbors, new people that came in that brought seeds. And Bill pointed out to me that there's more genetic diversity in that region, that 100-mile radius going around those different states, than there is in the rest of the country combined. Tremendous amount of diversity preserved, and that's because you have these small family mountain farms, and these farms could be anywhere from 25, 50, 75, 100 acres up in the mountains. That was a good bit. Now, the only crop that they got to market was corn, but not in the solid form. It was in the liquid form. A good friend of mine named Herb Claybo that lived up in the Smokies, he lived to be 103. He told me one time, he said, well, I could realize a lot more out of a bushel of corn making liquor than I could any other way. So this was one of the few ways they had to make money, to pay taxes and to go to Maryville once a year or Knoxville and buy farm tools that they couldn't make on the farm or other items that you had to purchase. So these stories, it's understandable that we have such a rich heritage and history here in this region. How many of you here tonight have gardens this year? Any of you have, there's quite a few hands going up. How many of you have some seeds from your ancestors, grandfathers, grandparents, uncles, aunts, neighbors? Anyone have, there's a hand back there. You know, for the longest period of time, these things were handed down. That was if a young lady got married, one of the most important things that she brought to the marriage was seed. That was to start out. They would ask, well, what did you start out with? I said, well, we had a cast iron kettle, a Dutch oven, a bedstead, a couple of plows, and different things that they had setting up. And I love the stories of, I guess all of you've seen quilts made in this region. The women would gather up, when someone got married, they would gather up and they would make all these quilts. They'd set up balloons and the ladies would sit around for days quilting. Of course, that was a good way to pass the news too. You didn't have any other way of passing and sharing news. So that could be an early form of gossip hour. So that was one people really helped out then. That's something we miss in this day and time. Most people don't know their neighbors. You ever notice some of the modern settlements, you have a button for everything. You got a button for the garage door, you got a button for the television. You've got well, you know what I mean. It's a atmosphere, a way of life that doesn't support community living, doesn't support neighbors and friends. Someone told me years ago that social life in the neighborhoods ceased to be when they took front porches off of houses. Because when we go back and talk about these seeds and the crops that were made from them, front porch socials were very, very important. If you went to visit somebody, chances are they had buckets full of butter beans, peas, beans to shell out, corn to shuck, and you would sit there and visit on that front porch. You'd be shelling these seeds out, whatever task was done. Then you had a good visit too. One of my favorite stories I remember from growing up and talking about seed stories was up in the mountains here. They had the tradition with the corn shuckings. That was a big deal. They would, when that corn was brought in, it would be piled in the center of the barn. Now, one of the things they did is they would put a couple of jugs of moonshine at the base and then pile that corn over it. They had to cover it up first or no work would have gotten done. It wouldn't get anything accomplished. It's the same way today. Anyway, they would do that, so they had this huge pile. And one thing they did for the young fellows there that were helping out, they would hide 2 or 3 ears of red corn in that. If a young fella got ear that red corn, shucked it and showed it, he got to kiss the farmer's daughter. So that was a plus. These guys were shucking away in a hurry to try and get to one of those red cobs. I'll show you some of that in a minute. In fact, Ashley, would you come up here a second? Huh? I'm going to pass one of the corns I want to talk about today. We got a Jimmy red corn that comes from the South Carolina region, and we also have one called Bloody Butcher. This Bloody Butcher has a real deep red color, and it's pretty self-explanatory how it got the name. If you could start one of these on this side, then one on the other, let people pass those around.
I'd be happy to.
Let people see what it looks like. One of the most gratifying things for me over the years in collecting seeds is the process of what we refer to as memory banking. Memory banking consists of, I'm going to say that I've come to each one of you in this room, and each one of you has a family heirloom, a seed. Well, it's fine to preserve that seed, but what if I don't have any story to go with it? What if I can't tell you the story that I just told you about the unknown pea? That gives it an interest. I'll give you an example of that. Up at Blackberry in the fall, we have tables filled with bowls and trays of seed that have been shelled out. And I like to make the example to our guests when they come through, something about the principles of our seed saving. Now on this table we could have all kinds of butter beans, limas, peas, beans, you name it, just bowls filled with all of these. Now if I show the guests these, they come along and look at the bowls and all these wonderful looking, beautiful seeds on the table. They're going to look at that and then they're going to say, yeah, that's pretty, I see. What else you got to offer? In other words, I haven't given them anything they can take home with them. I haven't given them a story that anchors them to a certain seed. And the one I'm going to tell you now is one that illustrates that point. There's a pea that we grow up at the farm which is called a wash day pea. The sample I got dates to 1792 from around the Charleston, South Carolina area. Now wash day was always on Monday. I never learned why exactly it was on Monday, but it was always on Monday. Now the ladies, they had one heck of a job of it. You had to go out there at 4:35 in the morning, build the fires under those cast iron kettles. Had to boil that water, shave the lye soap into it. You had big paddles to stir that with. There were battling blocks, battling sticks to beat the dirt out with. Rinse waters, several rinse waters. And you know, that is hard work. You got to have strong hands. You take a pair of overalls like this. That is hard work, just doing one set of overalls, one pair. So at the end of the day, all of you ladies here, I can promise you one thing. None of you were in the mood to cook us fellas a big old supper at the end of that day. So what we're going to get for supper is that wash day pea. It's a very small, round, yellowish tan pea with a dark brown eye. That pea would cook up in just about the same amount of time as you could bake a pone of cornbread. So that might have been one of your original fast foods, not the drive-through, but it was a fast food. This is one that you could make up in a hurry. There's a remnant of that, you know, down in Louisiana, red beans and rice, usually on Monday still, I believe. In schools and a lot of restaurants have red beans and rice on Monday. That's a holdover from wash day. Red beans could be simmered on the stove, and that could be served while all the washing activities go on. But you see, when I show guests that little bowl of those wash day peas, and they look at that and they hear that story, now they've got something they can take home with them. They can say, well, I learned about the wash day pea today. That's an interesting story that goes with it. Whereas before, that would have just been a little bowl of yellowish tan peas. Pretty, but there's not any meaning that goes with it. Some of the most interesting stories are the ones, to me, that I've gotten. I was telling you about the memory banking. The memory banking consists of as I was saying, each one of you in this room, we're going to use an example. Every one of you has a unique seed to offer, and I'm going to visit each and every one of you. Now then, when I'm talking to you, I want to know your family history, want to know your name. Where did you come from? Where did your ancestors come from? Where did this seed come from? Was it brought from another country, another state? How was it grown? Did it have special growing requirements? How was it used? How was it cooked? Anything at all. Was it a livestock feed? Anything at all that can help with that. This makes this living history. Now, one good example I can give you of what we call the living history part of it is a butter bean I have. Butter beans are the Lima family. Lima for Peru, Lima or Lima. Butter beans are limas. They're all limas, but butter beans usually refer to the southern speckled types that we find in the deep south. But they're all limas. It's like talking about cats. Are you talking about a calico cat, a Manx? What? They're all cats, but they're different categories. This red calico butter bean that I collected, I got this years ago as a seed saver. It comes from Upper East Tennessee. It's a beautiful butter bean. It has a deep red color. The seed coat is red, deep red. It has black mottling on it. And it's a beautiful display. If you hated butter beans, you'd love to have a jar of these in your kitchen, because they're so attractive to look at. Now, I was telling you, I like to get as much information as I possibly can on every variety, everything I collect. This one butter bean, the only information I have on that is it dates to 1794 in this family. In other words, they can document it back that far. The bean might be 300 or 400 years older than that, but this family can trace it back that far. However, with that one fact, 1794, we get a big hint on this butter bean. If you think for a minute, 1794, who was around? George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and all of the people of that era and that time. And you think, what would us fellas look? We'd have big billowing pantaloons on and shirts. You ladies would be sitting in these big, hot, uncomfortable dresses. And you look at the house and you think of the kitchen. You imagine those butter beans cooking in a big cast iron pot swung out from the crane over the fire. One of those walk-in fireplaces you can walk straight into. You look out the door and you see yokes of oxen pulling plows, large haystacks. Everything as it would have been at that time. But then we go from 1794 and start on down to present. And you've got a chain with no links missing in it, a big chain, all the way from 1794 down to 2019. And you think of all that time in between, all that history that's gone. So this is the living history in that memory banking, what we're preserving. And that's so important to go along with all this seed saving. Otherwise, we'd have 300 or 400 beans in jars. And what's the name of that one? Oh, I don't know, it's a bean. What's the name of this over here? It's another bean. I don't think anybody here would find that too interesting. But any of you who have seen any of the beautiful heirloom beans that we have here in this region, which are numerous, if you've heard the stories about those, known the families, then it becomes living history. It becomes living history, something we want to pass down, something we want to save. I think I asked if anybody I saw one hand at the back there. Somebody had a seed that was handed down. One of the things in selling seed stories that I want to do personally, I want to encourage people to become seed savers. We've had some good successes. This time that we're living in right now I refer to as a renaissance. We took about a 75-year leave of real food. You don't have to go very far to understand that statement. If you've gone down to the store and bought a tomato in January, you know it's made out of plastic and styrofoam. with about the same flavor. I always tell people, just go down to the art store and buy a piece of styrofoam, shape it like a tomato, spray it red. It'll probably have a better flavor. Beans, the same way. One of the great heritages we have here are all these different beans. We're talking about the stories of these seeds. If you go to the store now, you'll find generally 2 or 3 kinds of beans. They're nondescript, have virtually no flavor. I was amused last year. Ashley, you remember me talking about this seed catalog. It had a picture of some beans, and I showed it to you. And it said, our beans are a beautiful dark green, almost grass-like. Who in the world wants to eat grass? I want a real bean. But I mean, that's the way these things have come to us now. This is what we're, I want to say enjoying, not enjoying. If you go back to the heritage of these beans, the ones we've had over the years that have been handed down, they have such wonderful flavors. In telling the seed stories, I'd like to take you just on a little journey. We're just talking about the beans now. I'm going to take you through a typical season here in times past. One of the earliest beans that was planted was called the brown bunch. Any of you remember brown bunch? Yeah, that was a good bean, and you could plant it early. You could plant it in cold ground. It would come along and make pretty fast. After that, you would follow a lot of times with white half runners. They would come along. Half runner means it's not a full pole bean. It's not pure bush. It has some runners on it. Then later on, you'll see in the gardens, you'll be seeing these pole beans. I think it's one of the prettiest sights in the garden to see these beautiful poles up there and the beans growing across them, covering up those cane sticks. They're a beautiful sight. Now after that, the Three Sisters method of farming, are all of you familiar with that? The Three Sisters method of farming involved planting the corn. This was the Indian traditions. The corn was planted. When it was around waist high, you would plant beans at the base of it. Well, now this works 2 ways. Corn takes a lot of nitrogen out of the soil. Beans, being nitrogen fixers, and especially field peas, even more so, put a lot back. So you're getting, it's a wonderful companion planting, intercropping system. Now the corn has the advantage of having the nitrogen. It helps it out. Now the beans, they get a free bean stick to go up. They got that corn stalk to coil up. So that's the way those two work in combination. Interspersed throughout that field, you would have pumpkins and winter squash, cushaws. I know everybody around this region is familiar with the cushaw. It's a large winter squash that was brought here from 1700 from the Caribbean islands. It's white with the faint green striping on it. So your pumpkin vines and your squash vines, having these large leaves, these would shade out the ground. They would shade weeds out, and they would also help keep the moisture in. So it was a good intercropping system. You know, you'll still see that in some hillside gardens here in East Tennessee and up in Kentucky and North Carolina. You don't see it on a large scale, but there's some gardeners that still use this method, and with those cornfield beans growing in it. Now when they would plant the beans in the corn, this would be for a later crop. Talking of seed stories, are any of you familiar with leather breeches or shuck beans? That was a common way before the days of canning of preserving beans. When the beans were ready to be picked, ladies would go out, take split oak baskets and go out and fill those up with the beans in the cornfield. They'd get under a good shade tree, good oak, and have them quilts or tarp and sit on and pile those beans up. Again, another social gathering. You would string those beans, snap them, had needle and thread, and you sew up through the joints of the bean, and you'd wind up with a strand about this long. Those would be hung on the rafters of the front porch, and those would dry out. Now during the wintertime, they would often store those behind the fireplace on the rafter poles in the cabins, or they'd put them in leather sacks and preserve them until they were ready to cook. This is one tradition that's been passed down. A number of people will still do this. They'll cook those. Now, there's no real reason to do that anymore, except for the fact that it's an important part of our history and heritage, our way of life. It's like the music. You think of the old mountain music, all the old melodies, things that have been passed down over time. Well, these foods are an important part of our history, heritage, and culture. Again, there's no reason to do that as far as practical necessity. You can go to the store and buy beans 365 days a year. They won't taste like one, but you can buy them. And you can buy a watermelon in January. That won't taste like one either. Not to mention the tomato. Anyway, a number of people I know still do that. They still cook these. One lady told me a couple of days ago that she only does these. She'll do them Thanksgiving, Christmas, sometimes Easter, when the families gather together for special occasions. And it brings back memories of old. You think of your great-grandmother and your grandmother and your mother, aunts or uncles, and there's so many parts of that history that sparks our memory. The smell of it, the taste. It's just it's a part of our way of life that's worth preserving. The pumpkins I was telling you about and the winter squash, before the days of canning. You see, canning didn't come along until around the 1840s, 1850s. So what they had, they didn't have all that many choices. Pumpkins, they would take a knife and they would cut a spiral all the way around that pumpkin. And they would put those on poles up in the rafters for that to dry. And then you'd reconstitute that. Because you remember, anything they had to be a 365-day-a-year crop. No such thing as getting on the cell phone and telling Dad to pick up a gallon of milk and a loaf of bread down at the store on the way home. If you didn't have it yourself, you didn't grow it or make it, you just simply didn't have it. Some of the most interesting seeds I've gotten, I was trying to think tonight of some examples. I've got so many. One of the tomatoes that's always fascinated me, I got this from a fellow seed saver. To inform you on that just a little bit, I've been a member of the Seed Savers Exchange in Decorah, Iowa since 1990, a listed member. In other words, I'm in a big catalog that goes out, and the varieties I have to offer, which are 94, I have those listed in there. And that catalog goes from A to Z, apples to zucchini. If a member has it, it'll be listed in there. So that's a wonderful organization, the Seed Savers. We're going out there it's July, in the third week in July. I'm going to speak at the conference there. I'm ashamed to admit this is the first time I've ever been. You'd think that would be the one Mecca I would have gone to every year. But it seems like that's the time of the year too, that when you're so busy canning things and growing things that you just don't have, the weeds aren't patient with you. You've noticed all this rain we've had lately? If I could grow tomatoes as well as I grow weeds, I'd be a genius. The weeds wait for no one. And it's amazing. You can have your tomato plant up this high and that weed's this high, and you come back in a few days and it's surpassed the tomato. It's absolutely amazing. That's one point. Talking about seed stories too, is while we're mentioning weeds, so many of the things, now I'm speaking about Blackberry Farm and our chefs, they love to make use of a lot of foraging, a lot of the wild plants that we have around. Now, if you look at a Cherokee Indian garden 150 years ago, you wouldn't recognize it per se of the gardens that we're used to here today. In that garden, you're going to have all sorts of medicinal plants, what we would refer to as weeds, edible plants. Have any of you ever eaten lamb's quarter? It's a common weed. They'll grow up this tall. It's a wild relative of spinach. And there's purslane, the little succulent plant that grows along the ground. Dandelion greens, dock, all sorts of things, spring greens. You know, after they'd been in the cabin all winter long, it got rations got pretty boring. So when you got those first spring greens, it was a great delight to be able to go out and pick those and cook those before your other crops came in. Something an interest I've noticed up in the Smokies and hiking, if you go along in some of the areas where a lot of the old farmsteads were, if any of you are familiar with sunchokes or Jerusalem artichokes, you'll see those great patches of those growing where the old homesteads used to be. Now around the fenced areas of their gardens, they would plant the Jerusalem artichokes. It has nothing to do with Jerusalem. It's really in the sunflower family. They're about this big, and smaller sizes too. But they would plant these around that, and about the time of the year that the potatoes were giving out, March and April down through there before the new crop came in, they would dig these up and use this to supplement the diets. So that Jerusalem artichoke was another very handy food that they had to rely on. One of the all of these seeds have interesting stories. One of my favorites is a tomato that I have, and it's simply called the 1884 tomato. This tomato came from a pile of log jam. In 1884, there was a huge flood up in West Virginia, and on the riverbank, someone found this tomato plant growing, and there was logs and brush and everything all washed up on the banks, and this tomato plant was growing, and it makes a beautiful, great big red tomato. And I've got that one and grow it on occasion, but that's an interesting bit of history. While I'm talking about it too, for any of you who are interested gardening wise, I'd like to recommend two real good sources. You better get your notepads out or your phones, whatever you're recording on. The first one is called Southern Exposure Seed Exchange. Southern Exposure Seed Exchange is located up in Virginia. The nice thing about our phones and Google and everything, you can type up things and immediately pull things up. So you can get that address and have them send you out the catalog right away. And the other is my organization that I was talking about, the Seed Savers Exchange. And the Seed Savers Exchange is the largest nonprofit organization in the world conserving genetic diversity. In other words, not a governmental gene bank. So they're doing a great job at preserving these things too. In the seed saving world, I was amazed to learn just how recently all that has started. The Seed Savers were founded in 1975, and I mean, that to me, that's yesterday when you're talking about conserving genetic diversity, being able to preserve things. It's just literally yesterday, late in the 11th hour. But again, the great thing is we're having so many more people interested. I'll tell you an interesting fact that I learned last year. In 2017, there were more startup farms by young people than there had been in over 60 years. You know, that the alarming rate was going the other way. Family farms were going out at an alarming rate. But in 2017, there were more than there'd been in 60 years. And there is a tremendous, I do like to use the word renaissance because it is what's going on. And our guests that come up to Blackberry, I get a chance to, I refer to it as preaching the seed gospel. I get out and really get a chance to showcase these seeds, the crops we grow, and tell you a little bit about our seeds and seed stories. Blackberry Farm is a very good example of that. It's literally farm to table. Now, I've had some of the old timers that make fun of that saying. They'd say farm to table. When we were growing up, it was farm to table or starve. In other words, there's nothing new about any of this. This isn't something that's been discovered. This is just something that's been put back into use again. And it's so great to see it. And the number of young people, as I say, that we have as guests up there, it's incredible how many of them are interested in these things. And if I can get a couple of people interested in gardening, raising their own food, there's nothing like it. It's the greatest feeling in the world. You don't have to go any further than that tomato. What a wonderful feeling to have that tomato sandwich. Now then, up there, our artisans up at Blackberry, we have great bakers up there. They have these wonderful breads they make. There's only one thing those breads are not good for. That's a tomato sandwich. A tomato sandwich, you've got to have that plain old light bread. I wouldn't eat it the rest of the year, except that one time a year. That's got to be that light bread. Have some Duke's mayonnaise about that thick on it. You got 2 or 3 slices of that big tomato, and then you go stand over the sink, and it's just like it's like Niagara waterfall going down. But what a heavenly experience. And again, tomatoes are like Santa Claus. They come once a year. Take it and be thankful. The rest of the time it's plastic and styrofoam. Now back to those beans we were talking about. I don't think there's any better seed story than there is about beans. If you want to get someone hooked on being a seed saver, I don't know of any better thing than beans to get them started. If I was to fill up this table with all the different types I have, you'd be absolutely amazed. There are so much diversity, shapes, sizes, colors, uses. And I'm going back to the early days of our pioneers. Some of you have probably heard of dilly beans, haven't you? Dilly beans was pickling beans. See, they had a couple of choices. If you were preserving beans, you're going to have to either dry them, like we're talking about this, and we're talking about before the days of canning, or they would pickle and make dilly beans. It was a vinegar base. They had dill seed in it, garlic and cayenne pepper, and then corn that was pickled also, hickory king. A lot of you remember, folks around here call it hickory cane. It's actually hickory king. It was introduced in 1886 by Burpee Seed Company as a milling corn, but it's still around today because it's popular with the old timers as a roasting ear. Now you all probably know of roasting ears. We do a form of it today, even in the modern world, on your grills. You can buy the corn green in the grocery store and put it on the grill, char it a little bit, and that's really a modern form of the roasting ear. But in the old days, they'd put it in the embers, cover it over with ash, and let it bake like that. And then they would eat that. Well, the hickory king is not a sweet corn as we know it today. It's more of a starchy flavor. It makes wonderful fried corn or cream corn. That's that cream corn seed I was telling you about. Anyway, it preserved very well. It was excellent for making hominy. It was good ground into cornmeal, corn flour, grits, and it was also great for making whiskey. Isn't there a distillery in Knoxville that makes that, uses the hickory king corn? Anyway, there is a distiller that's doing that. And I was telling you about showed you the Bloody Butcher corn. There's a Jimmy Red from the South Carolina region. I believe originally it came from one of the Indian tribes, but Sean Brock, who many of you may know is one of the famous chefs in the country today. He has the McGrady's down in Charleston and the Husk. He's done very well over the years. He uses this corn exclusively in a lot of his recipes. Also, it's been used as a distiller. There's a whiskey made down in Charleston called Southern Revival. That's a wonderful flavor. Somebody gave me a bottle of it to Christmas and I forgot to bring it home. Lost it. Anyway, the reason a lot of these heirlooms and these seeds are making such a comeback is taste alone. You don't have to go any further than that. Our chefs up at Blackberry love to have these unique things to work with. We have approximately 4.5 acres of what I call kitchen gardens that we do. We don't have huge amounts of any one thing, but we have lots of different things for them to choose from. In the springtime, we have numerous kinds of lettuces, radishes, onions, Swiss chard, spinach, numerous choices for them to make. Now, another thing too that they love is having, we're talking about these beans and peas and all these unique things that they can come down and look for in the gardens. To me, I think of, when I talk about the chefs there, I think about myself because I went to art school, studied to be an artist, loved farming all my life. You can probably tell where this conversation is going. I picked the two poorest things there are in life. You can't make a dime at either one. But I wouldn't trade either one. Luckily, Blackberry discovered me, and I've been up there for 20 years and been very, very fortunate to work with them. But it's a joy to see the chefs come down, because they will come down and go through, and it's kind of like going to the supermarket for them. They go up and down, like garlic's on aisle 4 and the corn's on aisle 10. They have all these wonderful things to choose from. You think about chefs in a city. I mean, if you're a chef in New York City, it's kind of hard to pull a turnip out of the sidewalk. So they have many wonderful choices to make there. How am I doing time-wise?
Yeah.
What's that?
If you want to answer questions.
Yeah, I want to leave plenty of time if anyone has any specific questions they'd like to ask, anyone, or a thought they'd like to share with it. Because I always love hearing everyone else's stories. Over the years, recording things, I've had many notebooks filled up with just from guests visiting Blackberry that come in and tell me stories about their seeds and their families and interesting bits of history that go along with it. Talking about the history, one other thing, or seed story that comes to mind, that I have a little white bean, and the name of it is Little Joanne. Now, don't ask me who Little Joanne is. I have no idea in this world. However, this bean came from Virginia, and it was grown over the years by a man named Moses Bonham Glover. Moses Bonham Glover was with General Lee at Appomattox at the surrender. Well, there's a lot of history right there. You don't have too many blanks to fill in. Gives us a definite time frame. So these stories that come to me, I eagerly record them. Books, Ashley will talk about wading through all these books on the floor that I'm always writing in. Sometimes one of my worst habits is to take my overalls at the end of the day and pull all the seeds out and put them on the bed. You turn down the bed cover, and here goes peas and beans all over the floor.
Laundry's the worst.
Anyway, I would like to ask, does anyone have a thought or a story they'd like to share? Because they're every bit as important as what I'm talking about. Everybody's story.
I'd like to say that I still make hominy out of hickory cane.
Do you? And it's really good too, isn't it? That's
a lot of old timers considered it a field corn for the animals.
Yeah, but that's true, and it was introduced as a milling corn, which of course you could use for animal feed too. I like it as cut-off corn. You cut that down through the middle of the kernel, and then scrape the milk out, and that good fried corn, and it makes a wonderful meal.
Real tender if you pick it early.
It is. You got to get it just right. It's good tender corn today, and it might be mule corn tomorrow. It doesn't hold in the milk stage very long.
The ripens know when it's ready.
Oh, don't they though? They're a lot smarter than I am. I've never been able to beat them.
If you're interested in trying to experiment with some of these heirloom seeds on what you can do on your own,
yes.
What's the best access to? Is that Southern Exchange?
The Southern Exposure Seed Exchange, the one I gave you first, they have numerous ones from our region. In other words, Kentucky, Virginia,
so if you want to raise some heirloom tomatoes,
they have a lot of great ones. Yes, sir, they do.
If you're here, is that the best source, or is there other sources?
Well, there's the Seed Savers Exchange, but that's more general. In other words, that would cover the entire country. This specializes in our region. I would go home tonight and go ahead and type that in and get them to send you one out. Yes. Something that's amazed me over the years is just how much information, since I'm not much for computer. I wouldn't know how to turn a computer on, but Ashley helps me with the amount of information you can pull up is phenomenal. That's the great thing about that. I've typed in Appalachian beans, and just article after article, and people are selling those. One thing I failed to tell you starting out that I want to tell you, one of the most commonly asked questions from me, from guests that we have and other people in general, is how did you get started with all of this? Well, I can trace it back to one date. It was a March day in 1959. In Knoxville, or west of Knoxville, there's the old Ebenezer Railroad Station. It had been abandoned for many years. But one Saturday in March of 1959, I went down there and explored in it and found railroad timetables, magazines, old newspapers. But the prize that I found was a William Henry Mowell seed catalog from 1913. And the thing that inspired me the most about it was this catalog was filled with engravings. Engravings, you know, are very, very accurate at depicting things, a lot more accurate than a photograph in many cases. And so you had these beautiful engravings, and I kept looking at that. I had been gardening even at that young age, but I didn't realize just how much diversity there was. And I looked through this Mowell catalog, and I was looking at these beans and all sorts of things. But what caught me the most, caught my attention, was the Tennessee sweet potato pumpkin. It dates back to around 1840. This pumpkin stands about this tall, has a thick neck, comes down bell shape, white with faint green striping on it. Looks similar to a cushaw, the coloration does. But the flesh is very thick, yellowish color, and it does have a flavor very much like sweet potato, especially when made into pies. It's just a heavenly flavor. Well, for years I looked kind of like the unknown pea of Washington Parish, Louisiana. I looked for this Tennessee sweet potato pumpkin. No one had heard of it, knew where it was. A few of the older generations they had heard of it, but they hadn't seen it in years. Well, we fast forward on down to 1990, when I became a member of the Seed Savers Exchange. Lo and behold, in that catalog there were 4 listings for the Tennessee sweet potato pumpkin. I was so excited that I ordered all 4 members that had that. And again, just like those peas, I'd pour the seed out on the pillow and look at them, and I was like a child waiting for Christmas morning. Just couldn't get there fast enough. But I remember that first year I grew those, I had them in the garden up in front of the house. And they covered the whole, it was a great experience because I didn't have to mow, they covered the whole front yard. But they made a wonderful crop of them, and it was, I enjoyed passing that seed on to other people as well. And the point too about that catalog and looking for things, you take 1959, they had computers, but they were about the size of this room we're sitting in. No such thing as these little handheld devices. You know, a lot of times I'm doing talks up at Blackberry, and I'll be talking about a seed and the history and the story of it, and somebody will whip out the phone and click in a few letters. Next thing you know, they've got maybe a half an hour reading on one tomato or one bean. So it's amazing today the resources we have for locating things, and you can look that up instantly. Does anybody else have
She was talking to me today about her uncle, and I thought you might know what it was. It was like a pumpkin. They called it above ground sweet potato.
I've got the seed of that. I got that now. Yeah.
I'm hardly hearing, but they made the pies and everything.
Weren't they about that tall and about so long, tan color?
Washington Parish, yeah.
I've got some seed of that at home. Yeah. You want to grow some?
They passed away several years ago.
Did they?
None of us had any seed to it.
Yeah, I've got it there, but I got that down there probably
Bring it to the fair.
30 years ago.
Yeah, bring it to the fair.
Okay, I'm not growing any this year, but I can bring some seed down. Hello, yes.
Yes, do you have any concerns about pollinators, die-off pollinators?
Well, we have a lot of bees at Blackberry, and so far they're doing very well, but there's many other pollinators around besides bees, and we try to encourage that. In our gardens, we plant flowers that attract bees and other beneficial insects as well. So we have these all over interspersed with the crops, and also in the cutting gardens and the herb gardens. So we have a lot of help from those. We try to make it an environment that sustains good practices.
Would it be possible to get maybe a list of some of those things that you grow that help support?
Yes, absolutely.
How would one go about getting that?
One of the best sources that we have are your extension agents. They have all sorts of pamphlets and bulletins, and you can go to them and find they have different bulletins, pamphlets on companion plantings, insects, bees, all sorts of pollinators, and the flowers and things to plant to attract these.